What's good? It's Woog. 2016's Olympic super heavyweight gold medalist returns to the ring for the first time since his first professional loss. We've got Tony Yoka, 11 wins and 1 loss, taking on Carlos Takam, 39 wins, 7 losses, and 1 draw. This fight is taking place in Tony Yoka's home country. This is happening in Paris, France, and Tony Yoka, as I mentioned, is making his return after losing his last fight against Martin Bakole in a fight where Bakole was really putting a beating on Tony Yoka to where I thought that Yoka might get stopped in the middle round of that fight. But Yoka did kind of rally back and at least make it a competitive fight where it ended up being a majority decision win for Martin Bakole. And I kind of feel like that goes a long way psychologically in Tony Yoka's ability to recover from that first professional loss. And Tony Yoka, as I mentioned, is an Olympic gold medalist. He won controversially over Joe Joyce in the 2016 games in the super heavyweight division, bringing France their first Olympic gold medal in heavyweight or super heavyweight boxing. So Tony Yoka, as a professional, he was pretty hyped and he started beating, a gradually increased opposition. Johan Duhaupas. He stopped Alexander Demirchenko in the 3rd round. In fact, 9 out of Tony Yoka's 11 wins have come via knockout. He's won a decision over Christian Hammer, so Tony Yoka was looking like a pretty good fighter. The jury was still out whether he could be elite as a professional, but that was a big setback against Martin Bakole. Tony Yoka was the favorite heading into that one. I think he was a minus 350 going into that fight. Martin Bakole, by the way, has not returned to the ring since that big win over Tony Yoka. But as I look at Tony Yoka versus Carlos Takam or Carlos Takam, Carlos Takam is one of those veterans who is kind of the B-side in a lot of fights against very dangerous fighters. So he is more or less fighting like one elite fighter after another, which contributes to that whole win some, lose some looking record. In 2014, he lost via 10th round knockout to Alexander Povetkin. A couple years later, 2016, I remember when he fought a very close decision loss against Joseph Parker. That's before Joseph Parker beat Andy Ruiz to capture a share of the vacant heavyweight title. I think it was the WBO belt that Parker won in that vacant fight against Andy Ruiz. But before that, Joseph Parker had won a very close fight against Carlos Takam. And then a couple fights later for Takam, he challenges Anthony Joshua. And I thought he was on his way to becoming the first fight to take Anthony Joshua the distance, but they stopped the fight in the 10th round. Joshua was comfortably up on the scorecards. Carlos Takam was, he was getting beaten, but he wasn't taking a vicious beating in my view. I thought that they could have let that one go. And then in Carlos Takam's very next fight, he gets knocked out against Derek Chisora in the 8th round. So at this point, you're wondering, okay, what direction is Carlos Takam's career headed in? Because he was winning most of his fights, other than like the Povetkin loss and the Parker loss, fights against the elite guys. But then you see him get stopped in back-to-back fights versus Joshua, granted elite, Derek Chisora. That one was a pretty competitive fight until the time of the knockout, but that begins to get concerning. And then Carlos Takam won his next 4 fights, the 4th of which was a decision win against Jerry Forrest. That was like a 2020 fight, remember, during the COVID shutdowns, and they started to bring boxing back. One of the first main events that they had was Carlos Takam as the A-side against Jerry Forrest. Takam won that one, and Takam has had 2 fights since, a knockout loss or a TKO loss against Joe Joyce. He lost in the 6th round, got stopped, and then against Arslanbek Makhmudov. And a lot of people don't know about this guy, but he falls under the category of just kind of guys to watch, guys who look like they're very good, but nobody who's elite needs to fight them, so they're more or less avoided until they get like a mandatory title shot. Makhmudov is already 33 years old, but he's an undefeated fighter, and all of his wins but one have come via knockout. So he's one of those guys that you might want to keep your eye on. Again, his last name is Makhmudov, and Makhmudov beat Takam via decision, and Makhmudov looked huge in the ring against Takam. Carlos Takam is one of these heavyweights that's about 6 foot or 6'1". Makhmudov was closer to 6'6". Tony Yoka is 6'7", but Makhmudov is a lot broader than Tony Yoka. Tony Yoka is a little slimmer than Makhmudov. But yeah, the fact that Carlos Takam still went the distance against Makhmudov told me that he's still durable enough to at least hang with a Tony Yoka. I don't know how many rounds Carlos Takam is going to be able to win. Yoka, I would imagine, is going to be able to control range with, the 6'7" versus, we'll say, 6'1" dynamic. But one thing about Carlos Takam, who's from Cameroon, by the way, Cameroon is the home country of Francis Ngannou, former UFC heavyweight champion, is that Carlos Takam has like a slightly over 80-inch reach. So Tony Yoka, 82-inch reach, 7-inch height advantage. But even though he's over a half a foot taller than Carlos Takam, their reaches are within like an inch and a half of one another. So given his height, Carlos Takam has an abnormally long reach, and that's why he's able to throw so many of these overhand right hands. You look at Carlos Takam's game, he's one of these guys who always paws on his face. You know how you see some of those old school looking boxers who are always kind of like touching their face as they're like moving around? You're wondering, like, are they checking to see if they broke their nose? Are they looking for blood? Why do they keep on doing this thing where they keep on touching their face? Carlos Takam does that. I've seen him do that throughout the course of a fight in several different fights. I don't know if it's like a Leo Santa Cruz. You know how Santa Cruz like kind of turns his wrists and it's almost like habitual, but it kind of also serves as a little bit of a subtle feint. I wonder if that is a partially the reason why Carlos Takam does that, because when you're moving your hand, you're kind of looking like you might be throwing a punch, might be flinching, feinting, but he does it all the time. But Carlos Takam will also throw this pretty well-timed overhand right hand, and you'll be surprised how many times he catches much bigger opponents with it. Like, look at his fight against Joe Joyce. Yes, Joe Joyce did stop him in the 6th round, and Joe Joyce has like a notoriously good chin, but look at how many times Joe Joyce gets hit with that overhand right. Maybe he didn't really care about getting hit. I mean, sometimes it seems like Joe Joyce really doesn't mind getting hit with power punches, even though he was a little bit more cautious against Daniel Dubois. But Carlos Takam, again, for being a shorter heavyweight, who looks like if he was a little bit slimmer, might qualify for like that Bridger weight, 225 pounds or under, kind of subdivision, if you will. But Carlos Takam actually catches his opponents often with that right hand. If Tony Yoka could start game planning specifically for that right hand, I think Tony Yoka could pull away on the scorecards. He doesn't want to get lured into like a phone booth fight or a fight where he's giving up his height. You do want to maintain range, but again, the reaches aren't that big of a disparity, but because of Tony Yoka's like leg length, and the fact that he's a half a foot or a little bit more than a half a foot taller, he should still be able to control range. I look for Tony Yoka to pull away on the scorecards here, and I look for Carlos Takam to look like an increasingly reliant on a right hand fighter. I think he's gonna look somewhat inactive when he's not throwing that right hand. Tit for tat, I don't think he could hang with Tony Yoka. I think he's gonna look to set up those right-handed bombs and will otherwise probably be losing pretty demonstratively on the scorecards. Now, if Tony Yoka got a stoppage over Carlos Takam, that could go a long way, and I'm sure that he would like to get a stoppage. That would be a big rebound off of your first professional loss, to come back with a knockout over a proven, pretty durable veteran. I just think that it's more likely that Tony Yoka respects Carlos Takam's power, especially if he gets blasted anytime in the early rounds by that right hand, and that he ends up cruising to a decision win. But I would go with Carlos Takam going the 10-round distance and losing via decision if this were a 10-rounder. This is a 12-round fight. So I think that Tony Yoka is going to have more time to assert himself, more time to hurt Carlos Takam as Takam's volume starts to wane and he becomes increasingly reliant on that right hand. I think that Tony Yoka is going to find more opportunities to sit down on his punches and to do real damage to Carlos Takam. So I'm actually going to go Tony Yoka via late stoppage over Carlos Takam. We're talking somewhere between the 8th and the 10th, maybe 11th round, something like that. I think Tony Yoka is going to try to make a statement to try to kind of wash the stench of that loss to Bacoli out and to kind of reintroduce himself to the boxing public and to, remind people, yes, I can be a force at heavyweight. I think Tony Yoka is going to win big here. I think he's going to get the stoppage over the veteran Carlos Takam. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on Tony Yoka versus Carlos Takam. Do you think that there's any real chance that Carlos Takam wins this one and upsets Tony Yoka? As it stands, Tony Yoka is a significant favorite. I'm talking greater than 5-1 favorite. Like we're talking minus 550 to Carlos Takam's like plus 400. So significant betting favorite, Tony Yoka, and I do see him winning. To me, it comes down to whether or not he gets the stoppage versus the decision win. By the way, when Makhmudov fought Carlos Takam, Makhmudov was a greater than 10-1 favorite, like a minus 1600. That tells you how good Makhmudov is perceived to be. So again, keep your eye on that guy. I hope he gets a big opportunity. But yeah, I'm going Tony Yoka to defeat Carlos Takam via 8th through 11th round, kind of late middle rounds, or just late round stoppage. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.